So I'm Alanna Stuart, and I am a music artist and independent scholar. And this project emerged from my personal experience as a Black woman artist in the music scene that we studied, a field that literally trades in innovation, and that innovation is increasingly recognized as being driven by diversity. Although there's a lot of cynicism that pervades both academic and popular understandings of diversity initiatives, their pursuit remains a critical focus of study and an important aspect of organizational life. With few exceptions, most research on diversity initiatives has focused on its implementation in large organizations. And in those organizations, they tend to have legal or institutional mandates to deliver results. Whereas in Canada, at least 70%, a majority of the workforce, is employed in businesses with fewer than 100 employees, SMEs. This means any effort to redress a lack of diversity is carried out because of a desire to do so. We lack a firm understanding of how diversity is perceived and pursued in these contexts. So taking this knowledge gap as our point of departure, we examine the way people talk about diversity, as well as analyze the actions they take to increase diverse representation in order to understand how race permeates the Toronto independent music industry, a creative field comprised of SMEs, where efforts to increase diverse representation are largely uncoordinated and self-motivated. We ask, what do diversity initiatives look like in this context, and how do people make sense of them? Our research site then is the Toronto indie or independent music industry. Small labels, management teams, concert booking agencies, and promoters, as well as performing artists. So we took a holistic view of this field. And most of the companies in this field have somewhere between 5 and 50 employees. And in the case of many artists who identify as artist entrepreneurs, it's solely them. Most SMEs and creative sectors are oriented towards restricted production, where the dominant reward is symbolic capital. Because people in creative SMEs value other forms of capital in addition to economic capital, the practices and decision-making undergirding engagement with diversity may differ than what is found in large-scale firms, making it both a unique and important site for studying economic and non-economic valuations of diversity alike.
For the sake of time, I'm going to completely skip over the methods, except to say that we interviewed people working in this space, both white individuals and people of color. And the only thing I'll mention is that we gave space for people to self-identify in terms of race and ethnicity. But in the context of our paper, we used the binary category of white versus non-white, and that's simply to protect the confidentiality of those BIPOC artists we spoke to. And I'm happy, of course, to answer more questions about sample design and research methodology in the Q&A. So with regard to our findings, our interviews with performing artists and independent music industry personnel revealed the importance of two areas where diversity, which was most often defined as the representation of visible minorities, is sought. One, on management, band, and label rosters, and two, on festival and concert lineups. In each of these domains, increased representation of diverse artists is encouraged through informal quotas. Because such forms of representation are highly visible ways of achieving diversity, in contrast, for example, to actively recruiting people of color into behind-the-scenes organizational roles and positions of power, we refer to this phenomenon as marquee quotas. Marquee quotas are used as informal benchmarks for how well organizations and groups are faring in fostering diverse representation in the independent music scene. When asked their thoughts on the pursuit of marquee quotas, or diversity more generally, participants made reference to 4 ways of evaluating diversity: aesthetic, economic, reputational, and moral. As you can see on this in this table here, aesthetic, economic, and reputational valuations of diversity initiatives were most commonly used by white participants. Moral valuations were frequently used by both white and non-white participants. And we're next going to address each valuation in turn, beginning with aesthetic valuations. So white respondents often remarked that diverse representation on festival bills was important because otherwise things are boring. The implication is that the value of including artists of color is derived from the novelty they bring. For example, when asked whether conversations about diversity happen when he's pitching artists to festivals, Malcolm, who's a booking agent, a white booking agent in his 30s, shares that I do pitch the diversity of my clients to festivals. It's just part of my pitch. For example, I have a new R&B group. They're two gay sisters from Newfoundland via Madagascar. And I basically, well, what I told you would be a line in the pitch. I think it's exciting to have something different. So in this case, the act that Malcolm's representing is interesting in part because they're queer and Black. Thinking of performing artists of color as progenitors of aesthetic innovation is not inaccurate, of course. Throughout the 20th century in particular, Black musicians and artists have been responsible for the most important musical innovations, including jazz, blues, and hip hop. While recognizing people of color as purveyors of innovation may be useful in increasing their representation on festival and concert bills, it is also the case that this stereotypical link between race and ethnicity and novelty is problematic, and that it perpetuates the otherness and racial distancing of non-white individuals. In addition to that, rendering racial and ethnic identity as commensurate to innovation erases the work that people of color put into their art and the agency they have over their successes.
Though quotas for record labels, agencies, and festivals are not formally mandated, it is the case that government funding of the arts in Canada allocates grant money specifically for underrepresented groups. They're identified as priority groups in the applications. Several white industry workers were forthcoming about the economic value of diversity and their ability to earn extra revenue on the basis of grant funding. For example, Charles is a white manager in his 30s, and he strategically hires women to work for his company and chooses to represent certain Indigenous artists and artists of color in order to improve his chances of receiving government grants. And we'll get to how that benefits him in just a moment. So when deciding to work with one artist in particular, he mentioned that he was motivated because this artist had a quote unquote infrastructure in place. And that infrastructure was comprised of grant funds. He mentioned, so we raised $100,000 in grants. And there's that thing that happens in the Indigenous community, or sometimes when you work with diversity artists, is that you can weaponize diversity and take advantage of the tokenism. Access to grants turned what Charles described as a niche artist into a more viable client. In the capitalist structure, that client coming in with more funds meant that it was less of an investment and less of a risk to represent. He encourages his artists of color to weaponize diversity in order to take advantage of tokenism, by which he means race, ethnicity, indigeneity can be highlighted in the application process in order to increase chances of receiving grant funding and festival spots. As a manager, Charles takes a percentage, usually between 10 and 15%, of whatever money his artists bring in. So in this case, weaponizing diversity works in his favor as well. A smaller number of industry personnel cited reputational concerns as a motivating factor in the pursuit of marquee quotas. These participants believe that boasting a diverse roster would reflect well on them. Not only are there reputational gains to be had by achieving racial diversity, but potential losses to contend with in its absence. Many respondents articulated a fear of call-out culture and the reputational harm that could cost their company. The BIPOC artists providing organizations with reputational value by appearing on festival and label rosters perceive the costs of such reputational valuations of diversity differently. Langston, a non-white musician in his 30s, shared that it went from last year, everybody in the entire festival was white and a man. And now this year, it's definitely prioritizing women and people of color. And it's because they think they need to. It didn't feel authentic. So Langston feels that feeling, that sense of being tokenized as an artist and as a person of color when efforts to diversify lineups don't come from an authentic place or an authentic interest in his music, but rather has more to do with optics and publicity or the reputational valuation to the organization. The fourth and most common way of evaluating diversity was to provide moral justifications. Both white and racialized artists argued that diversity matters because Everyone deserves to have a voice, and everyone deserves to have their voice heard. When white participants justified the value of diversity on moral grounds, they often expressed concern about tokenizing artists of color in their pursuit of marquee quotas. And here we hear from 40 label manager in his 40s, a white label manager in his 40s, who reflects on his own label's approach to signing artists in a similar manner. He describes that the process of suddenly becoming really gross and cynical. I do feel like there are really great things happening in terms of a general awareness within industries towards trying to amplify more diverse voices. But with that amplification, there needs to be a more nuanced approach. In speaking of the need for a nuanced approach to achieving diversity, Brendan is reinforcing his own moralistic perspective that diverse representation needs to be genuine and occur across the field of cultural production with gatekeepers too, not just within the artist side. Accommodating diversity through marquee quotas is perceived by most participants, both white and non-white, and particularly those relying on moralistic valuations, as tokenistic, box ticking, or surface level. As forms of representation, they can be more beneficial to those who succeed in quote unquote ticking boxes, often white record label personnel and promoters, than the groups they're meant to serve. At the same time, our interview participants believe that marquee quotas have an integral role within the music industry economy. Interview participants highlighted that while the pursuit of marquee quotas has been successful at increasing the representation of racialized artists at the artist level, they don't amongst decision-making positions. Failure to foster diversity within labels, agencies, and other positions of influence limits the effectiveness of marquee quotas in positively impacting the experiences of racialized artists in the industry and moving from diversity to inclusion.
So just to quickly wrap up, we believe this project makes two contributions. First, our findings highlight the interplay of racialized valuations within moral economies, something that has thus far received little attention from economic sociologists in particular. Our data are at the individual level. However, research participants are drawing from their experiences as members of small organizations that collectively comprise the independent music industry. And the patterning of individually held valuations along lines of racial identity suggests that they contribute to the broader racialization of the indie music industry. As such, we believe that the findings exemplify Victor Ray's tenet that racialized organizations can limit the efficacy of personal agency. While moral valuations drive the majority of respondents' beliefs in the value of diversity, they circulate alongside other valuations that may be too self-serving to motivate the kinds of transformative organizational change that's necessary to move from diversity to inclusion, despite efforts to the contrary. And secondly, we provide empirical and analytical evidence of diversity initiatives in a field governed by creative SMEs. In the context of creative small and medium-sized enterprises that value forms of capital aside from the financial kind, the prevalence and importance attributed to marquee quotas means that they become part of the game, to use Bourdieu's terminology, the informal rules that govern fields of cultural production and influence one's social standing. Outside of the context of large organizations that are subject either to regulatory laws or HR mandates in their implementation of diversity policies, an economic sociology lens is vital for understanding valuations of racial diversity, because such valuations extend beyond the commonly held business case to include moral and cultural dimensions.
So this image visualizes the scenario that this research emerged from. It's a snapshot of the Toronto indie scene that I'm a member of. And this is from an article on the most frequently tapped artists in the Toronto indie scene, which I'm proud to be included on. And of the 15, most of whom studied jazz music at a university level and are influenced by R&B and electronic music, essentially heavily involved in Black music, 3 of us are not white. 3 out of the 15 most tapped artists are not white. What's particularly troubling about this image isn't just the lack of diversity. In fact, I'm friends with all of them. It's that it's from 2019, but it appears just as white as it did when I joined 17 years ago. What has changed over time is the conversation around the importance of diversity. So I initiated this work to better understand the discrepancy between talk and action, intention and outcome. If, as the subtitle suggests, this scene is responsible for redefining the city's approach to community and music making, then I need to expand my own sociological imagination to better understand what that approach needs to be. Thank you.